By 2032, ACT will empower 20.2 million more learners to exit high school ready for post-secondary and work opportunities. We will concentrate our work around 5 strategic pillars: build, inform, connect, mobilize, and partner. We are collaborating with key stakeholders to bring this bold new vision to life. We've got our work cut out for us, and with your support moving forward, we will make it happen.
All right, well, welcome to the session, Test Optional College Admissions at the Gazette's Iowa Ideas Conference. I am your moderator, Sarah Conrad-Baranowski. I'm managing editor at the Gazette here in Cedar Rapids. And this session is within our higher education track at the Iowa Ideas Conference. So we'd like to recognize Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor of the entire conference, ITC Midwest, as well as the sponsor of our education tracks, which is ACT. Thanks to them for making this panel and this conference possible. We could not do this without them. During our time together, we'll talk with our panelists and address audience questions. If you have a question, if you're watching this and you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box, and our tech host will forward those questions to me, and we'll sprinkle them throughout our conversation and try to get to them as quickly as we can. This session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. If you have any tech questions during the session, put those in the chat box and our tech host will answer them. So let's get started. I'm joined today by 3 panelists. They are Adam Ingersoll with Compass Education Group, Harry Fader with Fair Test, and Terry Snyders-Crumley from the University of Northern Iowa. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start by giving each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about how they're connected to this topic of test optional college admissions. So Adam, let's start with you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm one of the owners of Compass Education Group, a national provider of test prep and academic tutoring. So we are ostensibly the very protesting voice on this panel, but you'll find it's not always exactly true. On a personal note, I graduated high school in Iowa, as did my spouse, and we lived in Iowa with our 4 kids in public schools there from 2010 to just this past June. We moved to Madison, Wisconsin. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Terry, how about you?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Terry Crumley. I'm currently Director of Admissions here at UNI. I've worked in college admissions in the state of Iowa for over 20 years between both public and private institutions. So obviously test optional is a big part of my daily existence. And so that's how I'm connected to the panel.
Great. And Harry, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, good morning. I'm Harry Fader. I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, also known as Fair Test. I guess we are one of the principal proponents of test optional policies. Fair Test has been an advocacy organization since the mid-'80s that has called out against the misuse and overuse of standardized testing in education for admissions and workplace testing, et cetera. And our website is the repository of the test optional list of schools.
What is that website? Is it fairtest.org?
Fairtest.org.
Okay. So we'll start off with, not everyone who's watching this session may know what we mean when we say test optional college admissions. So I'm going to open this up to everyone. What does that mean? And why are we talking about it? And why is it worth spending an hour here at this conference to discuss this issue? Anyone who wants to jump in first, please go ahead.
I can start. Really, test optional is just a way that we allow as colleges students to decide whether or not to submit their test scores as part of the admission decision. And as Harry mentioned, this conversation has been going on for a long time, but it really accelerated during COVID and the lack of testing options for students. So I think since that time, it's really, like I said, a lot of colleges have 2 different options. Students will always have the kind of traditional standard track. At the public regional universities here in Iowa, we have something called the RAI, the Regions Admission Index. And that allows students to apply to any of the 3 state universities using their GPA, their test scores, and their core courses. And if they take that formula and they have a score of 245 or higher, they're admitted to our universities. But then there's also the test optional pathway. If students decide they don't want to submit their test scores, then they have the option of being holistically reviewed, and we look at them just basically their GPA, their transcripts, and their courses from there. So that's a little bit, maybe too much, that test optional, but that's
No, not too much. Adam or Harry, do you want to weigh in a little bit?
I would just add that you just heard a very good example of a test optional policy, but there is a spectrum of testing policies ranging from ignoring them altogether, we call that test free, to still requiring them. And the vast middle ground is making them optional in some way. There's also a spectrum of universities, of course. There is a regional public whose mission is to serve the state of Iowa and educate as many students as they can. They're not aspiring to be super selective and certainly not elitist. And then there are colleges that have a 3% admit rate. And you need every filter and piece of data they can, or at least they think they do. So they are technically test optional, but might prefer the test, and everything in between. So I think part of the challenge for families here is trying to take what should be on its face a pretty straightforward set of options and try to figure out the subtext, all driving towards tricky, rubber hitting the road questions like, how much time should I have my child spend on these tests? A lot, a little, none at all. Decisions like that can be pretty challenging for families in this context.
Yeah, I would add one more nuance to test optional, which is at many places, while admissions are test optional, a student can choose to submit scores or not submit scores. There are certain programs or scholarship programs that actually require submission of test scores in order to qualify. So, that we actually have a report on our website about those sort of merit scholarship based on testing sort of subset of policies. And Adam's right. I mean, there's a wide variety of types of universities in Iowa and in the country, and different schools sort of are going for different things when they are constructing their policies.
Okay. So I wanted to, I had this list of questions, and then yesterday or a couple of days ago, ACT announced that high school student scores have reached their lowest point in more than 30 years. And that's after 6 years of falling scores. So the average score for US students was 19.5 out of 36. Should we be worried about this? What does this mean? Are students less prepared for college? I wasn't happy to see this news, but to have this headline and knowing that we were going to be here talking about these tests, I wanted to get thoughts from all of you because you know about these things.
Well, can I start in on this one? Because here's a case the headline is actually a little more than a little inaccurate, because you have to look. And last year, we got the same headline. Actually, if you go back exactly this time when ACT released its data, it said that scores are the lowest it's been in 30 years. But we have to unpack the ACT numbers a little bit, because what happened to ACT is in 2016, it started losing test takers and its numbers. And it's interesting, you said it's been a 6-year drop. Well, that corresponds with that. And we have to look at the pool of states where it has been losing its test takers for a couple of reasons. One is test optional policies, but another reason is that several states, for their high school ESSA accountability numbers, have switched from the ACT to the SAT. And that includes Michigan, Colorado, Illinois. Also, the participation rates, the test taking rates on the coasts, California, Oregon, and the East Coast for the ACT have been going down. Now, California and Oregon, their public universities have test-free policies. And so in the last couple of years, the participation rate for ACT in California is down 74%. In Oregon, it's down 79%. Now, why is this all important? Because if you look at the data, the shedding of ACT test takers and I just have some numbers here. And this was I'm getting this from an article that was published in Forbes a year ago by my colleague Akil Bello, when this first iteration of, oh, the sky is falling came out. And the numbers are that if you take the top 50% of performing states, ACT shed 440,000 test takers. If you take the bottom performing states, they've shed 296,000 test takers. So I would submit that the data does not indicate, even if we were to ascribe to the ACT the magical power of detecting college readiness, which I question, the numbers really indicate a sort of, it's lost learners, not learning loss. And I would actually, call on the ACT to be, as an organization that prides itself on having integrity for their data, to be very careful when they say, oh my God, test scores are going down, there's a college readiness problem. Actually, it's more complicated.
Yeah, I appreciate the data that ACT provides, and they do some really good work. I agree with Harry. It's sort of the makeup of that mix. And I haven't read the study, so thank you, Harry, for all that data. I do think what we see on the college side is there has been a little bit of learning loss because of COVID, and how students have, it's just natural, right? They were pulled out of classes. So we have seen a little bit of that. But going back to the fact that the ACT, we have to remember, is about college preparedness. It's not about student IQ. And I think that's something that we always have to remember when we talk about these things. And I talk to faculty about this. We have to separate how smart students are versus how prepared students are. And we just have to think about how we better prepare them when they come on campus if we need to do that work. I'm really lucky because I work every single day with college students, and I'm really amazed at, while maybe a test score might go down, while other skill sets have gone up. And Harry will talk about this a lot, but the resilience, their technical ability, their ability to sort of focus in when they have all this noise around them that, Sarah, you were talking about earlier, applying to college on a typewriter. We didn't have all this noise and this craziness when we were looking at college. It was a phone call or maybe some mail. They have so much going on in their lives. So I do appreciate the information that ACT puts out, but I think we have to just put it in the context of all that. So, my 2 cents.
I'd like to stay with this one. To agree with both of the other panelists that the national headlines for reports like these are not that helpful, and you need to carefully interpret these data in their context, which is basically a shifting population. Harry made an interesting argument here. He said that these data largely reflect lost learners, not learning loss. I agree with Terry that there's quite a mix. And I think what you're also seeing is the lost learners. By lost learners, we mean people who aren't in the pool. They're not in ACT's data. I would submit that those lost learners that are no longer in ACT's pool would also tend to be the kids who experience the most learning loss, the most tragic effects of the pandemic. So this gets to the heart of the debate, I think, that's in front of us today, which is these tests are problematic culturally in terms of the weight they put on the educational system to deal with them. And the heart of the debate often boils down to, do the tests simply hold up a mirror to what we're doing and not doing in education, especially our horrific underfunding of public education? And are they a useful diagnostic tool in that regard? Now, a lot of people would agree there is some usefulness. Others feel that whatever value the ACT is providing as a reflection of things we need to invest in, or another indicator of readiness for colleges, many people question very deeply whether the weight of the entire enterprise is worth the benefit. The educational industrial complex around all of this, I'm downstream from ACT. I'm a for-profit actor within all of that. Should my industry exist preparing for these tests? I'm part of the reason why test scores correlate very, very well and very problematically with household income, with access to resources. The other part of the debate is, are there other pieces of the college application that are totally pristine, not subject to some of these problematic, complicating factors? I don't believe that there are. And if colleges are trained and then trusted to use the scores judiciously, appropriately, in context, never in a heavy-handed or cut off way of doing things, I have real disagreement with the Regents Academic Index. I think that's a kind of a real shortcut, problematic way to use tests. The test makers themselves, ACT and College Board, advise institutions not to treat their scores as cut scores. That implies a level of precision that these tests do not have. So there's a lot going on here, but I think the question you'll hear us keep returning to is the value of having the tests in the mix versus the overhead, the cost that comes with them. And at its worst, the practitioners who use the tests have used them to say, see, these kids aren't capable, so we don't have to try to support them. So the tests get a lot of criticism. The other argument, though, is that is a choice by the practitioners. It's not something inherent about the test itself. The test is an object. So I think the heart of the debate lies in what we're raising right here, and I'm sure we'll continue to unpack it.
Yeah, I just want to state my appreciation for the way you framed the question, Adam, because I think you're exactly right. It's about the whatever benefit we might gain in terms of the mirror it holds up to inequities and things like that versus the use of the test and what are its deleterious effects. Not only, I would argue, in terms of like the ranking and sorting problem, where you wind up ignoring and keeping out of higher education at various levels, both students of color, poorer students, et cetera, and also students who as Terry pointed out, like have different ways of showing their talents and are just like bad test takers in a timed setting, which is another critique. So I'm going to refrain from doing the fair test critique of standardized tests as a poor measure of what we want as a society, because I think they are. I don't think they give you an indication, and I think they also kind of, because they're used and perceived as being a high stakes instrument, they essentially infect the waters of education, because we wind up getting K-12 systems that are geared toward testing. And I think we as a country are kind of paying for that in the No Child, this has nothing to do with the ACT, in the No Child Left Behind regime that still has its vestiges in our K-12 system. Going back to what you said about sort of the costs and the benefits, there is use for testing. And I'll throw NAEP out there, right? As an example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress that's given at in the 4th grade and the 8th grade, it's sort of national tests, so where we see how kids are doing broadly. We disaggregate the data to see how subgroups are doing. The thing about those tests is they give us data, and I completely agree with you, Terry. Obviously, I was teaching during COVID on Zoom, right? So I can tell you that the kids that year did not get the same experience that the kid, and this is like 12th grade, they're already but you can't, and they're kids in their bedroom under their sheets with the and this is a fairly high performing school in New York City, but you can't account for that trauma. And obviously the lower grades, trying to get a 3rd grader to do this on Zoom, I mean, forget it. Even the most motivated with the most helicopter parent, there is going to be it's a lost year. My own son was in 8th grade during that, and I can tell you, like, math was a disaster. 9th grade, I'm sorry, it was in 9th grade, right? So like the algebra, no, not, and it hampered him. I mean, he's like kind of caught up now, but so there's no question that was a trauma. And so we're not ignoring it by saying that this is not a good instrument for determining access to education, to higher education. And let us not discount the origins of the tests, which, as I know, Adam, you can tell us, are steeped in racism and eugenics. That's just sort of the history of the SAT.
Far more true for the SAT than the ACT.
I said the SAT. I understand the ACT was
Okay.
post answer that, actually. But in any event, standardized testing in general has been used sort of as an instrument of exclusion because of the way of sort of culturally framed and dependent on the kind of knowledge that kids weren't getting in other communities. That wasn't necessarily sort of necessary, but it was just different knowledge, I would argue.
Yeah.
So
everything cuts both ways. I think, I was a student who was in some ways lifted out of poverty by a 11th grade PSAT score, getting a scholarship tied to that. Harry, as I understand it, a standardized test, in some way helped you get to Bronx Science and off you go. But the argument is that, and I think I'm agreeing with you, Harry, is there a more efficient and appropriate way to provide other options for students to be noticed and recognized and achieve? And that is a debate. Is the overhead worth it?
And that kind of, I want to bring Terry into this as working in admissions at a Regents University. I mean, how are you using, when test optional exists now, what are you using to decide who should be admitted? And I'd like to get other panelists' thoughts on what should we be using? Like, what in a perfect world, what would we use? Maybe not a perfect world, but even the world we live in, what should we be using?
Well, first of all, we looked even before COVID and all this happened. We always look at what are the success metrics of our students? Who graduates, who's retaining, what are the indicators? How do we look at data to make sure that when we're admitting them, we're admitting students that we know will be successful? And one of the things that we learned is that really for us, high school GPA is probably one of the largest predictors of success. And so for you and I, and again, as Adam mentioned, there's lots of colleges out there that have different missions, but for our mission, the GPA was a big indicator for us. So when we went to test optional, we are looking at the GPA in core courses, I should mention. There's students take a lot of variety of courses. And so we want to make sure in the courses that they're going to be needing to support their education here at UNI, that, as long as they're achieving a GPA, typically over 3.0, then they'll probably be admitted to UNI. I have been at some other private schools, and a lot of times, beyond the transcript, and we even ask this from time to time for students here at UNI, maybe we need some supporting documentation. Maybe the transcript isn't indicative, right? Maybe something happened in a student's life that we want to be realistic about. So can we get some information from the high school counselor? Or can we get an essay that explains what happened? I think what we're really looking for, remember, these are 16, 17, 18-year-olds, and I think about that, as a 50-plus-year-old person, like, I hope, your whole life is dictated at 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Really, should we be looking at just one metric, right? So we really do try to holistically look at students and say, what's the potential here? What's the motivation here? What are some of the grit that they've had to have in order to accomplish where they are already? And what is the promise that they might have for the future? So it's really a combination of factors, but when we sort of bring it down to the practical, realistic, what's happening in our office every day, we're looking at transcripts. And then when we see something that's kind of like a flag, we might ask for some more information when we don't have that ACT as also a piece of the information. So
I want to be clear, I'm not speaking for Terry at all. But she raised something really interesting. In talking about their work, she mentioned graduation rates as a metric to which they're at least somewhat beholden to, and an important one. That is a fascinating vector to talk about, because graduation rate, you can make a very strong argument, as a leader in the field, John Beckinsale, has very clearly, that graduation rates are an outcome measure. And arguably, a dip in graduation rate means that UNI is working hard to admit more students who are more at risk and will need more support and aren't a sure thing to come in knowing how to do college and getting right through it in 4 years. So we really need to take things like that with a grain of salt. And the universities are just so not in a silo. You know, you're in Iowa, you're subject to, you know, increasingly reduced funding from the state. The state stripping away a DEI office, support for students who arrive at campus with even more challenges. You have voucher programs, so a lot of the applicants to UNI are increasingly coming from underfunded rural schools who are underfunded because a voucher program is sending money to, you know, private school kids in the suburbs. There's a lot in mix here, and the admissions folks have only so many levers to try to manage these conflicting goals. And in that context, I think they should be trusted to use testing judiciously and appropriately. And I believe the vast majority of them do. I've yet to meet a person in Terry's role who, you know, sought that role and grew into it seeking power and wanting to exclude people. It's all about what can we do to help as many kids as possible and make them successful with a whole host of external challenges.
Thank you, Adam. That's great. I 100% agree with what you said. And there are a lot of dynamics, and you're also dealing with every individual student, right? And, you know, I think I have 2 kids that went to college, and, you know, we all maybe on this call have students that we're concerned about. And I would hope that any admission staff would look at my child a little bit individually, right? That while, you know, again, there's some efficiencies that we have to, you know, we have thousands of applications, you know, you want to do the work. And generally we know that if a student's a good student, they're probably going to be okay at their institutions. It's those ones that are like on the kind of the bubble that had something happen in their life that maybe somebody just needs to take some time and review their situation and say, will the student have potential and be successful here? And that's what admissions really at the core is about. We want to admit students, but we want to make sure that you're successful at our institutions. Otherwise, we feel like we do you a disservice. So,
yeah, I mean, I trust Terry to use scores judiciously, having gotten to know, and also I trust the university that you work at, given its mission, to use scores judiciously. The problem becomes when we have fixations in our society on numbers and data. And when that 35 comes in versus that 22, I can unpack and look at a student individually all you want, but there is a, you know, bleeding siren there that is fraught with a lot of history of the kid or the kid's particular talents or liabilities, in that like the time test just freaks them out, some kids. And so I appreciate the idea of holistic review and looking at a kid's both background, and I would submit as much as possible, you know, actual work, the way we do with athletes, the way we do with musicians, the way we do with artists. When a kid is applying to a music program, they have to show that they can play their instrument or sing a certain way, and then they're actually judged on performance. I understand that, and this is the trickle down into K-12, that too much of our primary and secondary school education is about memorization and then filling in test boxes or just solving a math problem and getting the right answer, as opposed to sort of thinking through what might be a non-routine problem or a harder problem that you're working towards, even at the 4th or the 5th grade. And so I think as much as possible, we have to be very careful with singular numbers. Now, the thing about GPA is at least you can unpack it and see the courses, see, all right, you know, they got A's in there in English and history. They maybe have a little math problem. They're not going to be an engineer. It's okay. They can handle our liberal arts curriculum, right? Or you give the opportunity for students to tell their personal stories through essays and stuff like that. But this number that is, allegedly a proxy for college readiness, is a dangerous number. And so that's, I think in the long run, and history has proven, given the disparate impact of these tests and what Adam indicated, the very strong correlation. I mean, the one thing the scores correlate to is family income. The predictive validity of the scores in the studies where schools have already gone test optional or test free, they're getting like a similar pool of kids, and kids aren't doing any worse by the time they get to their senior year. So I would submit the value added from these tests did not, and going back to Adam's formula, did not warrant their use.
I have a couple things here. The predictive validity thing, quick side note. Agree with what Harry said broadly, but there are exceptions. Brown University president claims that at Brown, an Ivy League school, the standardized test scores are more predictive than the grades. So many of their applicants come from, fancy private high schools where, teachers don't dare give less than A's, for example. The through line here on which we're all really come together is what should be the relevance and weight of these scores. What's fair to attach to them. And what I think has always been an interesting concept, and I'm helpful here as I've 30 years trying to raise scores, help students in schools improve. There's a few things. The tests, one thing that a lot of people agree that is very problematic about these tests is they can, for an individual student, they can throw off what we can call a false negative, a score that understates that student's ability for all kinds of reasons. No familiarity with the test. It's unfortunate. I'm going to, not criticizing ACT here, but tests in general. It's almost impossible to craft a standardized test for which there cannot be preparation that helps the score that has really nothing to do with academics. We can take two kids with equal levels of ability, however you define it, and so forth, and give one a fairly efficient treatment of just test optimization, making sure they perfectly manage their time. On the ACT, a particularly speeded test, they learn to work faster. They learn some quirks of how to best handle tricky multiple choice questions under the pressure of time. None of those skills that are being taught, I don't think Terry is like asking the educational system to give her more students where that's been assessed and treated and improved. On the other hand, so we have these false negatives, scores that don't represent the student's actual ability. On the other hand, we with these tests, we don't really have what I would call false positives. If a student gets a 35 on the ACT, they know the underlying academic content pretty well cold. And that is a nice check compared to, was their Algebra 2 class really generous grading? Well, this 35 on the ACT math corroborates that they know their stuff. So I think that there's no false positives. So you can kind of have a bit more faith in the scores, at least faith within the limited range of what credibility you should attach to them. The other thing is that the scores, and I'm a test prep person, so I will say this, I have to admit to this. Test prep can, depending on its form, the amount of time you have, can move scores significantly by teaching everything, including academic content. But we hit a ceiling. There's almost inevitably, and the data bear this out, almost every student who takes the ACT has a ceiling on their score that's lower than 36. That's just how the test works somehow. The pace, everything. There's no ceiling on grades. High test scores are the least common score in applications. High grades at competitive schools are the most common grades in applications. So there's that dichotomy that I think inevitably props up the value of some kind of objective standardized instrument beyond every high school left to themselves. I think you see some interest shifting to APs and IB as an indicator of that. And I last have to say, it's not my role to defend ACT, but grade inflation is real. And learning loss during the worldwide pandemic is real. And it's not ACT's fault that the headlines get dumbed down and they only show a bit of snippets from their annual summary. ACT has a lot more data they are sharing with schools, and those data show the learning loss by subject area, by level of resources, by ethnic group. And it is useful to help colleges and high schools, the whole educational system, better understand where is the bucket the leakiest, where do the most resources need to be brought to bear. And so I think it's what we keep going back to. There's both problematic aspects of the way we use the tests. They're also useful if you know how to use them judiciously. Sorry, that was a lot.
No.
No,
No,
go ahead, Harry.
Just very quickly, get to another question. Are they useful to the point of actually the benefit you get from them outweighs their exclusionary impact, right? Because
I believe it can. I believe it all too often doesn't.
Well, I think history is that it doesn't. Very clearly, history is that it doesn't. I understand that we're in a quote unquote new world right now. I also want to address the point of grade inflation. I mean, grade inflation is sort of like, it goes like on a scale like my hands are trying to sort of indicate, which is, it's not that everybody's getting an A plus. There's still a range of grades. It's just that the top, and I know it exists, but it has happened over the course of 40, 50 years. I mean, if you look at, just Harvard, right? If you look at the average grade at Harvard, when I went there versus, I didn't go there, but when I went to college versus when, let's say, my grandfather, would he have been in an American college? He wasn't. Had gone to college. I mean, it's striking. Like the average grade used to be whatever it was, a B or B minus, and now the average grade's an A minus. So grade inflation exists, but you can still look at grades within a range. You can still look at them within classes. You could look at the kind, you talked about AP. Now, I'm not going to defend AP as pedagogically, but it's an indication, at least for college admissions offices, of course rigor. So you can see, and I understand that the AP classes that are taken or not taken are bound, have an equity problem as well, right? Because it depends on where you go to school and what is offered, and college admissions offices have to sort of figure out what was available to a kid and what wasn't available to a kid when they're making these determinations, right? Which is all to say that the tests themselves, because of what they do to education and what they do historically to equity, are not worth the trouble. And that it is incumbent, I think, upon college admissions offices to look at grades, to unpack the transcript, to look at other things. And at the end of the day, right, that will get us a better and fairer world.
Harry, I simply think you speak to. Go ahead, Terry. Yeah, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I think all of this is going back to, these are all different pieces of the admission of a student, right? And that, we want to do what's best for students that come to it, no matter where I worked, whoever students we admit, we want to help them, right? And so all the GPA, the ACT, the AP, the IB, any of these things help us get a picture of a student and how can we help them when they come to our institution. I have certainly admitted students in my life that had a very high ACT score, that had 35 on an ACT and maybe a 2.2 GPA. And that says to me, this student has a lot of potential. What's going on? What do we need to do to make sure when they come to college that they're going to be successful here, right? And I've seen the opposite. I've seen the 4.0s with an 18 on their ACT, and I think that's a hard worker, right? That's somebody that's probably going to come and work really hard, but what else can we do to support that student, right? So I think all these different pieces, there's never going to be one piece or one thing that's going to help us, because none of us are just one thing. We're many different pieces. And I think that goal of college admissions is to say, how does a GPA, how does a test score, how do extracurricular activities, how does an essay, how do all these things help us prepare a student and when they come to school here? The other thing with college GPA inflation is yeah, that's a problem. And I'm just going to blame parents for that. Because everybody wants their kid to be a 4.0,
Guilty.
and they go back to the high schools
Guilty.
and they make these high schools inflate GPAs. So that's something that is really a problem, that if we could say 4.0 is 4.0 and every class you take is 4 point, but they're taking AP to 5 point, they have honors. When I start seeing honors choir on transcripts, that's a problem for me. I'm not a music person. I love music, but should choir be a 5.0 scale? I think that's a whole nother conversation we should have that's different than testing. But again, I think we need to take all these things as pieces of the puzzle as opposed to just one thing. So
I used to get in
It's so
trouble
important. Yeah.
using to give A pluses.
yeah.
I think it's so important. Terry's voice is here, as the practitioner on the front lines. Harry and I agree far more than we disagree, but around the edges, I take issue with the declaration that the tests aren't worth their weight. I think that's an open question for a couple of reasons. One, they may be worth their weight in certain contexts. Number two, it's sort of a watch what you wish for thing. When the world went dark and testing was canceled and not available, and schools went online, my company has since then had just an all-time surge in demand for academic tutoring to help. Well, the tests are now gone, so let me make sure that the grades are as pumped up as they can be. Or let's do a lot of academic tutoring support to make up for the deficiencies of online school. So kind of another case of the rich getting richer and always exploiting, opportunities that for others are simply only risks. And on just a practical level, I don't rely on anecdotal data, but I have 4 teenagers. My oldest is 19 this month, and her entire high school experience is basically marred by the effects of the pandemic and some other things, social justice issues swirling. And, her friends, they knew, they went to high school there in Iowa City, where they're like, yeah, we know, A's are the new B. The teachers are so flexible, online school, there's so many ways to kind of work the system. And she now just completed her first year of college, and the proof is in the pudding. Her classes, these are high achieving kids at a very well regarded public high school in Iowa. And without exception, they are less prepared, not just academically, but also just mentally, emotionally, than some classes that came before them. So if colleges want to use a standardized test as a tool to help shed a bit more light on that and help them better, identify and support students, I'm all for it. If the educational system or bad actors want to use it as a cudgel to say, these kids have to be left out, then we're doing it absolutely wrong, is my opinion.
So we had a discussion before our panel today, just so we could all meet each other. And we got into a conversation about, with tests being optional now, if you're a parent or a student, or you're like, I have younger children, but this will become an issue for me. Like, how do you know whether they should take the ACT or the SAT, or whether they should submit their scores in this optional world, like not knowing, will it help them? Will it hurt them? I'm sure it depends on the school also that they're applying to. But how do parents and students navigate this world that is very different now?
Treacherously.
That's not
I'd love to hear the practice.
I would love to hear
Yeah, I would say
I would love to hear Terry's info answer first would be helpful, I think.
Practically what I would do is, if you have a sense of where you're going to be applying, if you're going to be applying to Iowa schools, you're going to be applying to Ivy Leagues, you really should probably just go to their websites and check, like, what's their policy right now? How are they accepting scores? For example, even in the state of Iowa, we have slightly different ways that we do test optional. At UNI, if you send us a score, but your GPA is higher and it doesn't affect anything, we don't bother with it, right? But there might be another institution that takes that score as a piece of that admission decision or scholarship decision. So I would first of all check the website of just, you don't have to check everybody's, but if you have 3 or 4 colleges that you're thinking about, I would check those first. If you're nervous at all about, should I take it, not take it, we always say take it, but don't send the scores anywhere. You don't have to send the scores places, but take it. That way you have a sense of where you are. You know, it might be that you are a superstar and you take it and you get a super high score and you're like, whoa, I didn't realize I was, again, it's not, but it might help you. It might help you in some way in college admission or scholarship. Otherwise, you could just hold on to it and decide what you want to do with it. So that's how we've been talking with families. Check the websites, take it, maybe hold on to it, see where it helps you. If it helps you, use it. If it doesn't, don't use it. Those are our general advice for this. So
this is what I do, is try to help schools think through this, and against context. So I think, Terry, I'm guessing like the majority of your applicant pool are sensible, level-headed Iowans who don't get carried away and excessive and overthinking, and for the most part, and you have an index. It's just not as confusing, and you're able to be so straightforward and clear about what your policy is and isn't. That's not always the case. And wise philosopher once said that you can't harm a human being by giving them more choices. As I've observed the test optional milieu of policies the past 4 years, I don't know that that's always true, because what this has provoked with the families that have a lot of resources and overthink it and are trying to get into the super selective elitist schools, for them it's just a new version of game theory, and they are working through it and trying to reverse engineer universities' processes and figure it out as best they can. But at the end of the day, if you've got a student who's applying to 6, 10, 12 colleges, it's quite likely that every single one of those colleges will be some version of test optional. And it's not always easy to know which one is a school where it simply is omitting scores can't hurt you, but they might help you somewhat. And here's the level of score that probably would help, and off you go. Other places it's more subtle, and there can be gaps between practice internally and externally stated public policy. I'll give you a quick example. I won't name the name of the university, but highly selective. Okay? They went test optional like almost everybody else in spring, summer of 2020 in response to the pandemic. They were extremely strong and adamant in their public statements that optional means optional. You should not feel pressure, to take this test if it's not safe for you or not available. We're not playing games here. We don't want anybody parsing the language of this policy. It's truly optional. Well, 3 years on, that same school, its head of admissions in a podcast just last month explained that in fact at that school now the testing is recommended, and then that appeared on the school's website with no fanfare the next day. Here's my point. I'm quite confident that college did not pivot 180 from optional is optional to, well, actually, we recommend the test again. We prefer them. That didn't happen on a dime that evening when he said it on his podcast. There was a process. They're leaning back into testing a bit more evolved with total opacity to, most of the marketplace. If you have a really in-the-know college counselor, you might kind of get this subtlety. And I don't fault the person in Terry's role at that college. They're subject to just these really difficult bureaucratic political pressures. No one on their campus agrees about what the role of testing should be. But if you are a parent and a student or a guidance counselor at a public high school, you've got 400 kids per class, trying to fight through that subtlety and play the game theory as well as the most well-resourced kids. I think this is a negative, inevitable artifact of not being so broadly dependent on testing and giving kids more choices. There's a lot of complexity under the hood here. And the last thing I'm going to say on grade inflation is it behooves you, if you're interested in that, to really look deeply at ACT's data, which they make available. I think what they show, especially in the last 3 years, is pretty unassailable. And I think it's problematic. And I'm not saying more ACT is the solution to that problem. But the data are sound and put together by thoughtful people.
Wait, so what is the solution to that problem? Is it parents not pushing for their kids to get A's? Is it, we want to talk about solutions, not just problems, but how do we solve this problem?
Book.
Move 80% of our
I may recommend
move 80% of our federal defense budget to starting with prenatal care, and fund education, pay teachers, like the
Oh, just that.
what they should get. Yeah, I mean it's an
Yeah.
incredibly fundamental structural quagmire.
You gotta feed the pig. You can't just weigh it. So yes, the educational system needs a adequate funding, overhauls of the way we think about teaching and learning and how kids should be assessed in the classroom. I'm not talking about the admission stuff. But I just want to. Adam's absolutely right. The opacity of it, or opaqueness, whatever the right word is, makes the test optional policy subject to gamification, and parents with resources will do everything possible to try to figure out like what the right strategy is. And I will say that if you talk to admissions folks at the UCs in California, which have gone test free, the entire system, from the Cal State system, which sort of serves everyone, to Berkeley and UCLA. And they will tell you that this just getting rid of, and I've heard the UCLA, and Adam, I'm sure has heard him and her say this, like we had 14 factors, now we have 13 in doing admissions. And thus, by getting rid of the test, we just sort of get rid of this thing that was exclusionary when it was sort of factored into the formula. And so, maybe that is a plot, the gamification of it, at least at the levels of the highly rejective schools, is a case for test-free policies as opposed to test option policies. And but you're absolutely right about, we're band-aiding and trying to make the best of a system that has so many fundamental flaws, which is our public K-12 system. And yes, funding, Head Start, doing all the things that would create public schools that are more consistently produce good citizens, kids who can think critically, kids who can solve problems, kids who get to pursue their talents. And unfortunately, given the inequality and inequity of American society, we don't do that. And so now here we are debating about how does a kid get into college? And we have grade inflation. Every single measure that we use to admit kids into school, into university, can be scrutinized from an equity perspective. Let's take the extracurricular activities. Of course, rich kids, right, have more access to extracurricular activities, and that becomes a thing on the transcript. And I agree that it is incumbent upon the admissions office to sort of look and see what was available to them. Did they have to, work at the 7-Eleven in order to help feed the family, right? That is a consideration. That is absolutely a consideration. Again, I'll just reiterate the problem with the single standardized test score. It's like one number, and it's one number that has this overhang historically. Now, we're chipping away at its. Maybe the good thing that comes out of this is that as a society, for the most part, COVID happened, and lo and behold, college admissions still went on, right? And so we've sort of chipped away at the importance of it, perhaps, but I think we still need to be vigilant, right, about it being sort of brought back into the fray in a way that is exclusionary and discriminatory.
Can I ask Terry a question? Terry, imagine you receive about 148,000 applications, and you have hundreds of readers, and you have a clear mandate from your state to prioritize building a class that more proportionally represents the diversity of the state of California. And you out of that 140,000 applications, 90+% of them are well qualified and would succeed at your school. and you just have to pick about 10,000 to admit, and most of them will say yes. In that context, throwing out test scores is, you didn't need it. Most of your applicants are well qualified, and it liberates you to meet. Ultimately, your employer is the state. You meet their mandate to shape the class accordingly. You didn't need it as a shortcut because you can't get enough readers. That's kind of the context of the UC system. And I say that while I think the way test free has unfolded within the UCs and Cal States has been wildly successful, full stop. The negatives are trivial compared to what that unified system with the state government behind it has wanted to achieve, period. But we always have to be clear about the unique circumstances, and we just can't make broad statements like they didn't need the test, so that suggests no one does. Well, it's complicated.
It is very complicated, and I'm glad I'm not in California. It would be really hard. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about admissions at UNI, but and you were there before test optional? Or you've worked?
Yeah, I've worked other places. Yeah.
Yeah. So when ACT or SAT, when test scores were a part of it, can you compare those days when test scores were a key part of it to now? And is the work that you're doing, the way that you're admitting students, is it vastly different?
Well, I'll just talk a little about before test optional, students used the region admission index. So our students were admitted pretty much, 75% were admitted right away. That, they use the index, they're in, they don't have to wait for us to make those decisions. During, right after COVID, 12% of our students were automatically admitted, if that makes sense, through the RAI. That means we were reviewing over 80%. That's a lot of time of staff, and we're happy to do it. The frustration for students was it took a lot longer for us to get back to them, right? So there's some efficiencies that the ACT brings to a division operation. I would have to say, again, just going back, it's just one of many factors. And I would say before, when we had it, it was nice as a piece of it. But I also know it's really nice to have flexibility where I have students that just can't take it for some reason. And now I don't have a barrier for them. I don't have to say, you have to come into the office and find a way to take the ACT before I can even admit you. That's how it used to be. And I would even have adult students coming back that, and this was other different institution other than UNI. And it was our policy, you had to have an ACT. So you're 35 years old. I'm making you take an ACT at 35 so you can come to our institution. That was kind of crazy, right? So I do think that, as an institution, we like the flexibility. We like it. However, we do respect the test score. We respect it as a piece of information that will help us in the bigger picture of admission to help a student know if they're going to be successful here. So
a little bit like you go from 14 measures to 13.
Yeah, right.
The single greatest benefit of test free and for the UC system in California has been that it has no longer is the testing and this intimidating thing that discourages students from applying. That's the number one benefit, and that's how they've been able to really diversify their classes, is just expand the pool, and especially expand it into communities that they just hadn't been reaching because kids hear, oh, the scores have to be so high there, I won't even apply. This is much less intimidating, and there's some comfort in knowing not only am I welcome to apply, I won't be competing based on test scores with anybody else either. That's for those students a nice thing about test free. I'm also well aware there's been students who part of what they think will make them competitive is a very strong test score, and that holds no currency in California, so they're looking elsewhere. Again, unintended consequences and those things. So here we are.
Yeah, a quick little data point for you and I actually was, as we look at the students that do apply test optional, there's about a 10 percentage point higher number of students that are Pell Grant eligible that apply that way. So it definitely has helped students that have financial issues getting to the test, taking a test, and we have seen expansion of diversity on our campus. And we think some of that's due to test optional as well. So.
Well, I mean,
I think test optional is the least worst policy because of what Terry just said. I think it's the least worst of the available policies choices available to colleges with the current testing regime.
yeah, I mean,
my opinion.
I think that what you folks said are sort of evidence that this is a good idea. Adam, you said something very interesting about sort of the pool. If you're at the UC, you have this pool, and now you've got for 10,000 seats, you basically have 30,000 kids who qualify, who would be fine to enter the. How do you distinguish among those? You know, with diversity and having it reflect the population of California. Now, the kid who didn't get in would say this is unfair, but it's really not. If you take those 30,000 and randomly pick one out of three from the hat, as long as you're meeting your reflection of the population criteria, right? I would submit that as a public university, there is nothing wrong with that, as long as the kids meet these sort of threshold criteria. We have in our heads this idea that if I got a 36, and you know, this is what you read in the national press, this kid got a 36 and he has a 4.8 GPA. I know that's not a thing, and he has a 4.8 GPA.
Actually, it is.
I don't live in that world. The 4.8 or a 5.0 5.2 GPA, and he got rejected by Harvard and Brown and Yale, whatever. I'm like, yeah, but he's now working on the Google campus. I think that was an article, right? So what, right? That is not inherently particularly unfair, in my humble opinion.
So I'm loving this conversation. We are actually out of time. I'm sure that we could go on for another hour. This has been really wonderful. And I was excited for the session because I knew that you all would have this spirited conversation about it. But unfortunately, we have to end. So first, I wanted to thank our panelists for participating and bringing so much of your knowledge and experience to this conversation. I think we've all benefited from it. Thank you also to our audience. We've had quite a few people watching this conversation. And thanks finally to our sponsors, ITC Midwest, which is sponsoring the entire Iowa Ideas Conference, and then ACT, which sponsors the education tracks of our conference. And this session has been recorded, so people can go back to it and watch, or you can send it to someone who maybe is interested in this topic. And that it will be on our website at iowaideas.com.